Hello, and welcome to another episode of Goblin Lore. In this episode, Alex and I discuss the cultural reasons about why the plane of Rabiah will never come back into Magic the Gathering. This is an issue that I feel personally very strongly about, and this is an issue and a subject that can be a little bit sensitive for people, especially those who have had their cultural identities marginalized. We want to see Magic the Gathering be a place where cultures can all be valued equally, where people can see themselves in the game. Representation is always one of the most important things about a game being engaging to people of all walks of life, from all cultural backgrounds, and from all different places in the world. It's for this reason that we recorded this episode, even though we know that as two white guys from the upper Midwest of the US, we are going to get some things wrong. We are going to perceive things different than a lot of people will. But we hope to use our platform here to start or continue or add to conversations going on about race and culture in Magic the Gathering. And hopefully we can help perpetuate this conversation and make sure that we don't make the same mistakes in the future that we have in the past in terms of representation in the game that we love. You'll also notice my passion coming out in the fact that the last 5 minutes of this episode are me just being on a soapbox. So if you're excited for that, like I am, and was, get ready. Without any further ado, let's get to the show. Hello, Podwalkers, and welcome to another episode of Goblin Lore. This episode, we are a little bit shorthanded. We are coming to you with only 2 of our usual 3 hands, and I know that that's a little bit tough to fathom having 3 hands, but we're talking about mythical creatures, yeah. So why can't we be mythical too? Think the triple striking goblin from Unstable. That's usually this podcast, but for now we're just a normal 2-headed goblin. And this week we are going to be talking about Rabiah. And actually, I don't know if it's pronounced Rabiah or Rabiah, but we'll get into why that's a question and an issue, because we're talking about why Rabiah is kind of a problem for Magic storyline in the past, and why we're never going to go back there again. But before we get into all that, I am going to have my co-host introduce himself, and we are going to have our intro question of, if you could choose any plane in the multiverse to make your home, what plane would that be?
Well, I'm Alex Newman at Alexander Newm on Twitter. And my first instinct, and the thing is, thinking about it, I don't know that I have a fully rational reason to answer, but my first instinct was Theros. So I'm just going to go with Theros. I know I really enjoyed the flavor of the set. I just really enjoyed ancient Greece. I mean, I was a philosophy major for a little while and read a lot of ancient Greek from people from ancient Greece. But just the setting, I think the world feels very vibrant. There's a lot going on in that world. So yeah, I think that's probably where I would pick for my home.
Yeah, it's very beautiful, very, pastoral. And there's kind of this cool faith-based element of, like, you can see what you believe in happening in the world. That's kind of cool.
Yeah, and it's a nice varied place. It's not one of those like science fiction ice worlds or volcano worlds. It's there's a little bit of everything going on. Seems like a good place to just globetrot.
I love it. Well, and I am Joe Redeman. You can find me on Twitter at Fyndhorn. That's FYND Horn. And part of me really wants to be hipster and pick somewhere like Olgrotha, which if you don't know Olgrotha, it is the setting of the Homelands expansion set, possibly the worst Magic expansion ever. We can get into Ogrotha later, some other time.
I imagine it may come up in this very conversation.
Oh, it's
later
possible.
In the podcast.
It's certainly possible. But Ogrotha is kind of like it's a horrible dying world, and there's a small section of it that is like livable. It's like if you were to build,
dying.
Yeah, that's slightly less dying. But even there, you still have like terrible people all over the place. It's just bad. So anyway, forget Ogrotha. I'm over it. I think that I would actually pick Zendikar, because even though Zendikar is kind of like the world is, the terrain's in upheaval, and it's still, at this point, it's still rebuilding itself from the Eldrazi attacks. It's a really beautiful world full of plenty of places to explore and adventure, and kind of the same way that you were saying, Alex, there's a ton of varied climates there in Theros. That's the same thing in Zendikar. You kind of have this realistic seeming world, but it does have sort of that unifying theme of adventure and exploration.
Seems good.
What doesn't seem good, though, is a certain particular plane that we're going to talk about here. And for the sake of conversation, let's just nail down one pronunciation, and let's call it Rabiah. That might be completely wrong, because it's based on the real-life culture of Arabia. And so maybe it's Rabiah, but we're going with Rabiah.
If we don't know the right way to pronounce it, I like the idea of just picking one and probably being wrong regardless, but just committing to being incorrect and just carrying through.
So Rabiah, or Rabiah the Infinite as it's known, is, like I said, it's this plane that's based on the real world setting and culture of Arabia. Saudi Arabia, the Arabian Desert, all of the sort of Middle Eastern cultures kind of smushed into one.
Which because we're going to be talking about the flavor of this plane, and I think some other planes, so I don't want to go too deep on some things, but this was introduced to Magic as the setting for the Arabian Nights expansion, which was the first expansion for the game, and in fact was created by Richard Garfield in a very, very short amount of time, because for not story reasons, for real world reasons, Wizards needed a new product to sell. They needed something else to put on shelves, because the game in the first couple of years was just continuously selling out. And so he made this set. He picked a setting that he knew he could, whip out a bunch of cards. And so it was based on the 1001 Nights collection of stories from the Arabian sort of Middle Eastern culture.
Yeah, and so this was kind of it was the first expansion, but it was also the first top-down expansion in that way, because it was based on, an IP. It was based on an intellectual property. It was based on the story of the 1001 Arabian Nights. And so every card basically relates to one of those stories in some way or another. That's where you have the Old Man in the Sea, you have King Suleiman, you have Scheherazade, you have all sorts of nonsense.
Yeah, including the names of real places. Library of Alexandria, the Bazaar of Baghdad were both cards in that set. That also is a part of, as we're going to kind of get to, why this is a setting that Wizards is never going to go back to. The first and one of the most problematic issues with it is that it includes locations from the real world that are very, very heavily based on a culture, as opposed to, we've seen recently with Kaladesh, where there is definite inspiration from a real world culture. They took, I think, from my perspective, a lot of care, having not belonging to that culture. I don't want to speak for other people, but it seemed like they took a lot of care to take some inspiration from that culture, but make it its own thing. Say, this is Kaladesh. It has some Indian inspiration, but it is Kaladesh. Rabiah does not really have that distinction.
And so that's kind of what we're going to get into in the second half of our podcast, more talking about that real world connection. Let's sort of run down what we know about Rabiah, since it is early on since it showed up early on in Magic history, we don't have a ton of backstory for it. Like you said, Alex, Richard Garfield churned out this setting really, really quickly, and so it's not like there was a lot of Vorthos consideration to this. Well, a lot of it was sort of back explained to be this plane. If I remember right, this was theoretically supposed to be sort of set on Dominaria in a different continent or something, and then they sort of said it didn't really work to do that, so actually this is Rabiah. It's a different plane.
That I'm not sure. I don't know some of those story pieces from back then. I do know one of the things that didn't help the lack of Vorthos in this is because they made it so quickly, the flavor text is entirely from real world sources.
Right.
A lot from the 1001 Nights, there
was a fair amount from the Bible as well, right?
Yeah. So there's quotes from the Quran too, I believe.
So Rabiah is a solely desert plane. So kind of the opposite of what we were talking about with the varied climates of Theros and Zendikar. Rabiah is a completely desert plane. Even more, I guess, the weird quality, the unique quality of Rabiah than just it being a desert world with dunes and oases and all this stuff is the fact that long ago in its history, there was something called the thousandfold refraction, the thousandfold refraction, where Rabiah's magic was sort of shattered or reflected or splintered. We're not exactly sure of any of this, of how it happened, of who did it, of why they did it, any of that. Again, this is all very vague, long time ago. This was, God, over 20 years ago now in magic history. But somebody did something to Rabiah that made it multiply 1,000 times. And so literally there were 1,001 different variations of Rabiah. And so, again, you tie flavorfully sort of into that story of 1001 Arabian Nights. But each of the Rabiahs was slightly different than the other. And it was sort of that idea that has been talked about for a number of years now in our world, that there are infinite universes out there with infinite possibilities and infinite different variations of us. Each little choice point is a digression and whatever. And so that's kind of how Rabiah was shaped, is, there might be a Joe and Alex somewhere in Rabiah 1 podcasting on a show called Goblin Lore, and then there might be a Joe and Alex somewhere on Rabiah 397 podcasting on a show called Gin Lore. And, just...
Oh, I thought you were going to iterate and say Goblin Boar.
There you go. That's 472.
Yep. Or is that somewhere in between because it's still goblins? See, alternate, right. Dimensions get really confusing.
Spectrums are tough, too.
Yeah.
But yeah, so you have this world where over centuries the planes are evolving independently of each other, but they all have very similar cultures. And from out of this comes one of the first planeswalkers we ever find out about, and the most powerful pre-revisionist planeswalker, Taysir. Is one of the cooler ideas, actually, I think, of pre-revisionist planeswalkers. It would never happen in Magic story today, but it's pretty darn cool. Essentially, Taysir was born on 5 different worlds of Rabiah. 5 different Taysirs were born on 5 different Rabiah worlds. And so during that refraction, he was copied those 5 times, once for each color. So each of these copies manifested a gift for, using this particular color of magic. There was a green Taysir, a red, a white, a blue, a black. And he was sort of like, kind of Harry Potter style, prophesied to be like the one made of 5, the greatest sorcerer that the world had ever known. That the world would ever know, I guess, at that time. And so each of those refractions had led a different life. Red Taysir was a nomad. Green Taysir was a herder. Blue Taysir remained a baby, which is super weird. White Taysir became a whirling dervish, a warrior, and then Black Taysir became sort of an assassin, and Black Taysir started hunting down the other Taysirs, like found a way to go world to world. And when he tried to kill the other Taysirs, he absorbed them into him and sort of became this amalgamation of all of them. And once the last Taysir was absorbed into the whole, his spark ignited. The 5 pieces of his spark were reunited as Planeswalker spark, and he, became a Planeswalker. And so not only was he a Planeswalker, he was a pre-revision Planeswalker, a pre-mending Planeswalker, and he was one of the few Planeswalkers who has ever mastered all 5 colors of Magic. And so that's pretty darn dope. And I mean, this is, to me, this is one of the cooler origin stories of a Planeswalker, and kind of is facilitated by the weirdness of Rabiah's world.
Yeah. Which is interesting. Like, it's a story you can't really tell in a normal plane. It's the whole the refraction gives some interesting storytelling things, but the plane itself it's just a myriad of things that make it difficult to bring back. But I think that's a really interesting story.
And it's so. Yeah, you're right. It is like, it's difficult to do. It's so confusing to follow that story, even as I'm telling it. And I know this lore. I know this lore. I've got the Gamepedia page sitting in front of me to help me refresh. It is tough to follow, and that's one thing we'll get into here too. I'm just gonna wrap up, I guess, the bit of lore about Rabiah here, which is. Once Taysir became a Planeswalker, the sorceress who had encouraged him to hunt down his other selves, in order so that she could control his power and, control Planeswalker. She was furious that she couldn't harness his powers, and so once Taysir walked away from Rabiah, she created a barrier around the Rabiahs, preventing him from ever returning. So what a lovely little in-lore way for Wizards to ensure that we can never planeswalk back to Rabiah.
Yep. That's a nice clean way to just and that was that.
Well, and that sort of gets us to part of this that especially I know you wanted to talk about, Alex, which is Mark Rosewater's Rabiah scale.
Yes. I personally think these things are really interesting. He has a couple scales, the Storm scales for mechanics, but this one that we're going to talk about today is the Rabiah scale. Basically what Mark Rosewater does is he builds a scale 1 to 10, and it's the likelihood of a set coming back in a standard legal set of a thing. So 1 being very likely, will definitely, for in this case the scales, 1 is we'll definitely see again, most likely very soon. 10 is Rabiah. I mean, never. The actual description is, I would never say never, but this would require a major miracle. So the point of, and he gave kind of a list, and he numbered things out, and people will talk to him about different things is, does this change this? Like Dominaria recently moved from a 4 to a 1 because of the popularity of the set. The Dominaria set this summer. And so it's just, I think it's a really interesting way for Mark Rosewater, who's the head designer, and especially in this case too, he's not tied to creative, so he doesn't have quite as much weight in this, but it's a great way for him to kind of communicate with the community and to share, information in a very quantifiable way. Just saying, giving, because he can't say, well, I know we're going back to this set until they're ready to announce it. But he can say, well, that's about a 4 on the scale. If someone's asking about a world that they really like, talking about Vryn, that's a 4 on the scale. So that gives Mark the ability to kind of answer questions and talk to the community about this stuff. And it gives the community the ability to kind of quantify where Wizards is at, or at least where Mark thinks Wizards is at regarding some of these different worlds.
Right. And so that's why Rabiah is at the top of this scale. Rabiah is the only 10. There are a bunch of 9s. There's planes that have been destroyed. There are planes that have been, encased and locked away. There are planes that were just kind of meh.
Yeah. The Elgrotha, or, my favorite, like you were saying, the planes that were destroyed or encased. Planes that technically exist but would be difficult to travel to. Sarah's Realm, Wrath, Phyrexia, old school Phyrexia.
Right. Yeah, all those sit at 9, but Rabiah is the only one at 10. And that is kind of what we want to talk about today. Culture in games and how you represent cultures in games. And for the sake of this discussion, we're going to kind of be defining culture as sort of heritage, or the culture that you live in, sort of your cultural setting. We talked a little bit off air, Alex, about how there are things like gamer culture or magic culture or nerd culture in general, or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I think some of those things are important, and those are important communities with important sort of defining factors in and of themselves. But it's a little less, I think, intrinsically tied into people's identities and quite frankly, into people's bodies. Yeah,
and of course we're talking, relating to magics and magic sets being based on cultures, and those are going to be world cultures based on locations and demographics and things, as opposed to like the office culture at your workplace, which is totally a thing. Like anytime you get two people together who spend any amount of time, there's culture there, but that isn't super applicable to what we're talking about. So at some point we kind of have to draw a line and say, okay, we're not going to talk about that then.
Right. Yeah. So for the sake of this discussion, we're talking, cultural, demographic type things. And so that's kind of the big problem with Rabiah, is not even just that it's tough to do from a legal standpoint or design standpoint or creative standpoint. It's tough to do this from a representation standpoint. And I think that's good that Wizards has actually started to recognize that, because Rabiah presented a world of Middle Easterners that really was just a sort of a hodgepodge mess of geographic non-selection. And there's, because, this is something I alluded to earlier on in the episode. You don't have just Arabia in the Middle East. It's not just all Arabia. There's Saudi Arabia. Yeah. There is Oman. There is Yemen. There is Jordan. There's Lebanon, Syria. You even have
Arab Emirates.
Right. Qatar.
There's a lot.
You have even Middle Eastern cultures that are not Islamic or Arabic. Mm-hmm. You have mm-hmm. Israel. You have Turkey. Those are completely different cultures.
And then you have things like Egypt that has a lot of its own history and culture, but because of where it is, it's right in between a lot of the like Middle Eastern, what we would consider Middle Eastern culture, and a lot of the Greeks, like Egypt,
and African.
Yeah, it really was in the middle of all this and influenced by all of it.
Right, absolutely. And so, I mean, again, and that spreads out because obviously all these places are connected to one another. But, mm-hmm. You even get further out into Iran, which has a lot of Central Asian influence. You mm-hmm. have, tons
Persia.
of...
That's where Persia was and sort of broke up. And, like, you go a little bit further, you have, ancient Babylon into, modern day Iraq.
I think you're right.
Yeah. So like there's all manner of stuff in there of what we would just, paint with the broad brush of Middle Eastern. It's like there's a lot there. There's a lot there now and a lot going back down all sorts of different lines.
Right. And so that's sort of the issue that you run into when you're creating a game or some sort of fictional world that is based on a real world culture, or even more so, I guess, sort of an amalgamation or a stereotype of these cultures, is you get this muddy picture that is sort of just a, like, it kind of almost becomes a caricature.
Yeah. And I think, unfortunately, helping that character, making it more of a caricature, the set includes Aladdin. Like, literally, there's a card called Aladdin in Arabian Nights, and it calls out named characters, it calls out named places, and that just doesn't really fit with how Magic Design has been going forward. They've been trying to have their own places, both because it's better to have the creative control of it, and because then they don't have to worry as much about doing something insensitive, doing something just wrong with the culture. Right.
And so a couple of things, I guess, that really I guess let's start with some of the problems with Rabiah. The problems, the main facets of problems are things that are sort of spiritual. I mean, you have passages from the Quran, which is the Islamic holy book, on these game pieces, basically, and that can be a little bit disrespectful. I don't know if there are any Muslim Magic players who, particularly don't feel like it is, but I think there should be some acknowledgement of the fact that it can be a little bit issuesome if you don't think about the way that that's represented and how you're doing that. There are some things, parts of Rabiah too, where it's entirely a desert. Well, the entire Middle East is not a desert.
Yeah.
There are beautiful, coasts. There are the rolling hills of Israel. I mean, there's beautiful parts of that world. But it's all we see is, like, a camel on the sand dunes, and it's like, well, okay, sure, got it. We're in the Middle East, cool.
Yeah, put some sand on there, and then we know it's the Middle East.
God. Well, yeah, and also too, another part of this that I didn't mention in the lore part, but Rabiah was originally, back when this was a thing that happened pre-mending, Rabiah generates random planar links to other planes. And so, it might one of the shards of Rabiah essentially might brush up against another plane's meta space, and those planar links, those portals, manifest in Rabiah not as like a portal, not a shimmering like portal that appears somewhere. It's a giant desert twister, like a sandstorm, and it's just like, I don't know, something about that just strikes me as weird.
Yeah, and I think some of that just ties to Wizards kind of realizing after they were, a couple years into the game, not even that, like their very next set was Antiquities and then Legends, and like they started to build their own mythology and build their own worlds immediately after that. I think they kind of realized that that's not the direction that they want to go in almost immediately, and so I think their thing was, well, let's just not make a big deal about it. Let's just leave that alone, and we're not going to do that anymore. And I mean, outside of kind of being an anomaly in one or two cards that make a big splash in the older formats, the Arabian Nights doesn't really show up in Modern Magic.
Well, and another part of that too is, I don't remember if the card is exactly named this, but the whirling dervishes are also mentioned. The dervishes and and the dervishes are, initiates of the Sufi path of religion, or the Sufi order of Islam. It's sort of like, if anyone is Christian, this is just my easiest reference point. It's like, this would be like Lutherans, for instance. It's one sect of the greater religion. But the whirling, that dancing, the spinning dance is a form of, celebration and praise and prayer. And so it's a little bit weird that it's then becomes this soldier card, essentially, And so again, you have this weird sort of mushing of a real world thing into what the game needs, rather than taking ideas from a real world culture and sort of then interpreting them into the game. You know, it's more of a direct rip, and then I guess you're pulling something out of it and then putting a new idea over it, rather than taking the idea and sort of shaping it into something completely new, you know?
Yeah.
And I guess that's maybe a good point for us to talk about. We've seen Magic do this really well in recent years. And so we don't want to completely bash Wizards and Magic for how they've handled culture, because I think, and again, we're both two upper Midwestern white guys talking about this, so we don't know exactly, and maybe this is going to be something that we're going to learn more about, and you know, I'm open to that. But I think they have, at the very least, improved in the 20 years since Arabian Nights came out.
Yeah.
In how they handle real world cultures. Like we just had Kaladesh a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I mean, and they've done a few, and I think Kaladesh is actually not the most recent. Amonkhet came out after, but
you're right.
Both of those based on not even based on, and I think that might be the difference here. They weren't based on real world cultures. They were inspired. They took elements from those cultures and built their own world, but used elements and inspiration from those cultures to kind of suffuse that world and to build more life into it. I think in both places you could really see that, especially Kaladesh, I think, had more of that. Amonkhet definitely had some Egyptian, but inspiration. There was definitely inspiration there, but that was also a lot of Bolus inspiration in that world too. So there was some other things going on there as well.
Yeah, they definitely took the aesthetics from Egypt, but it wasn't an Egypt story. I mean, like, the closest thing they had to a story Egyptian wise was actually that it resembled the biblical 10 plagues sort of narrative.
Yes.
Which,
and I think
fine,
in the actual first Amonkhet set there was little bits, like the Serpapod is thing from Egypt. I just know
snakes.
that because of the Serpapod from Amonkhet is an element from Egyptian stories and things, and I only know of that thanks to Sonia Greer, who's at Rude Jedet, RUDJEDET on Twitter, who's a big part of the magic community and also an Egyptologist. Amonkhet was real interesting if you followed her, because she talked about a lot of just stories from Egypt in general and different little elements that Wizards put into the set that kind of tied to things. And so there was definitely pieces of that there, but I think overall they were going more for the Bolus flavor on the world of Amonkhet.
Yeah, that was definitely, she's a great follow in general, but she was getting to hit home run after home run while Amonkhet was coming out. That was great.
And right when that set was announced, she was very excited, rightfully so. Like, those are like her two passions coming together, and it was great to watch.
Yeah, no, Amonkhet was definitely a great example of how you can take some elements and aesthetics of a world, you know, drop in some of those cool little references so that people like Sonya can see them and go like, oh, this is really cool attention to detail because XYZ, without it being about that culture, without it being based on that culture.
Yeah, and it also allows them, you know, someone like Sonya to share that with the community.
And then we get to learn.
Yeah.
We get to learn more about that culture's history. And maybe Amonkhet's not a great example because ancient Egypt is obviously a dead culture at this point. We've moved well beyond sphinxes and pharaohs and such. But another great example, I think, at this point is Kaladesh, where you do have, again, some of those references. You have, lots of very Indian-sounding names. I can think of Pima, Rishkar, Rashmi, Sahili Rai. I mean, these are all very sort of like Indian sounding names. On top of the fact that there's caste system, which I'm not sure that a lot of people really caught going into Kaladesh. I didn't see a lot of talk about it, but that's kind of a reference to India's colonial history and the imperialism that was foisted onto it. But then we see this revolution story where this caste gets thrown off, caste, C-A-S-T-E, these rigid structures of categorizing people into social hierarchy ranks. We see that get thrown off, and this revolution, this equality happens by the end of this. And so I thought that was actually a really cool, possibly accidental, but I'm gonna hope that it was intentional reference to how India has made social progress.
And I think a big part of what made that a better use of a real world culture too is, like I said, they made it their own world.
Right.
So there was definitely influence. There was definitely references, some maybe deeper than others, but there was definitely elements there. But then there was this whole clockwork invention thing. There was this whole aether element. So there was a lot of world building around it to make it its own unique place that just had these elements to make it feel more real, I think. And I think that's when it's at its best.
Right.
And
you have the little spice in there, but it's not the meat of it.
And it adds verisimilitude to these things when you can add this little bit of the real world. It makes it feel more real.
But we can only talk about this really, in our own opinion at least, from the perspective of two middle-class Midwestern white guys. And that's, that is a very limited and often privileged worldview. And so sometimes, often, honestly, we should be listening to somebody who goes through this experience, who goes through the process of seeing their own culture represented and reflected in the game. And so I wanted to also bring Shivam Bhatt's article into this. So Shivam Bhatt is a great Magic creator, a Magic content creator, awesome dude. You can find him on Twitter at Electrotal, ELEKTROTAL, or Gearpoor Gears. But Shivam wrote a piece on Tumblr back when Kaladesh was released, and I just want to read like a brief section of this, and we'll link to his article in the show notes. There were people with Indian names, coloration, hairstyles. The buildings were all weird Mughal architecture that had been splattered with a million colors, as if the artist had seen one picture of the Taj Mahal and the movie Aladdin, and then decided to spray paint them together. It was an amazing anime, but it was not Indian, or even India. All those buildings and clothing styles were Persian, not Indian. And over I was told we didn't want to offend anyone. We didn't want to step on real beliefs or real cultural influences or do anything to make anyone mad. So, no four-armed Vidalcan or elephant-headed Loxodon or gods, fine, but then they kept going. No snakes, no monkeys, no rakshasas, no Indian birds, no cultural markers of any kind at all. Literally, just the skin. No, it is not what I've wanted. It is not what I've waited my whole life for. This isn't me, or my people, or anything to do with me. So that's a really powerful and different way of viewing Kaladesh than we had.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought his perspective into it too, because we don't have, as you said, you and I don't have a lot of perspective on that culturally. So having his the best way, if you don't have a perspective, is to go listen to other people who have a perspective, who have that perspective. That's the best way to learn, is to just shut up and listen sometimes, like a lot of times, really.
Yeah, and it's that lived experience that we don't have the lived experience of not seeing ourselves in media. There have been plenty of white male protagonists in media all over. Just talking about Magic, the beginning of Magic, the first real, central story hero that we had was Gerard Capation, white dude. But there wasn't a ton of representation other than that. I mean,
the original Weatherlight crew itself, there was a good kind of smattering of people, humanoids, both fictional and real sort
sure.
of representation. But to your point, that the main sort of character of the story, the central protagonist of the story, white dude.
Yeah, and I came away from reading the Weatherlight Saga at first going, oh, okay, that's great. Great story. Awesome. I come back to it, a little bit later. I look at the cards, all that sort of stuff, and I realized that Sisay was the captain of the ship. I didn't get that in my first reading because Gerard is the guy. Gerard's the dude in charge, it seems like. And so that is kind of how magic positions itself. And so you have this, sort of bring it back to Kaladesh here and Shivam's perception of it and perspective of it, which is totally valid and totally fair. He has all these experiences. He knows this culture in and out, and he goes, that's not even my culture. So where we see, okay, this is a step in the right direction, we see this is something, and we see that sort of treating a subject matter and a cultural inspiration gently, Shivam sees that as disrespecting that, and that's completely fair and valid, Yeah,
and I think this point is it's like they're trying so hard to be respectful that they're not actually engaging.
Right.
Do you think that seems a decent read of what he was saying in that quote?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's fear of offending somebody by being too representative of it, so far that you dilute it down into something that it's not.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important thing that we do need to realize too, is that being truthful to source material and being truthful to cultures that inspire is maybe more important than even just the step in the direction. We've talked about this when I was in teaching school, sort of how do you teach multiculturalism authentically, and there's kind of different like stages of a multicultural classroom. One of them is sort of the like you talk about it, or like you do just like the minimal bare surface level type stuff. Like we all sort of like knew vaguely about Cinco de Mayo as kids, and like maybe you learned it, maybe you learned it was a Mexican holiday, or maybe the next level is like, oh, and then you guys wore little sombreros and ate like rice for lunch that day, and like did a little thing about it. But like the next level is actually engaging with the real meat of what it's about and thinking through, and like actually learning like, okay, no, this is a completely different thing than just like a celebration. Like this is where it came from, and this is who is involved, and this is why it's so critically important to this culture. And I think that's what you see here. And you do see too that like that cross-cultural mushing that we talked about with why Rabiah was a bit messy too, because it wasn't really just Saudi Arabian or one specific culture. It was just kind of this messy mush. You get that too in Kaladesh.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, Arabian Nights was kind of a high level of what people in the West would recognize as things from the Middle East, and that's smashing a lot of different people together and not really representing any of them. Right.
And we do see that a little bit with when we have top down or for lack of a better term in this discussion, but skinned sort of sets where there is some sort of culture laid over it. Mark Rosewater has said specifically, like, we want to do the touchstone things that people will recognize. Like Egypt set, gotta be pyramids, like, sure, I get that.
Yeah.
But you also want to be true to the culture, especially when it's a living, breathing, vibrant culture. Like Egypt, ancient Egypt is dead. At a certain point, like, we do know that, like, okay, yeah, the Egyptians today still exist, but they're a very different culture than the Egypt of old. Whereas there's still a living, breathing, vibrant, thriving Indian culture today.
And all sorts of it's a big place with a lot of people. There's a lot of different cultural touchstones to the whole thing that aren't necessarily applicable to all of them. Like any given place in the U.S., there are cultural touchstones here that just don't that aren't universal to the country.
Right. Yeah. Like you said, there's huge different regions.
It's just a further complication of, well, then what is this, Indian, or what is this American, or what is this thing that we're trying to represent?
Right. Absolutely. And so I think it's important to recognize that there are multiple facets to this, and there's no easy answer to figuring out how to do a cultural take responsibly. There's no easy answer, but one of the surest ways to get closer to it is to bring in people who have those lived experiences, who have that exposure to that culture, and have them guide you and lead you. Mm-hmm. And I think too, it helps for something being appropriately representative. Something like Amonkhet or Theros, planes like that are reasonable and non-problematic because we're not only removed in space, we're removed in time. We're removed, 1,000 years from those places, and so that is super helpful for it being. It's a little more of an artifact as opposed to Rabiah is based on, and I say based on intentionally there. Rabiah is based on some of the lore of a living, breathing culture currently today, and it uses references from living, breathing religions, and that is hugely dangerous.
Yeah, and just difficult to walk and kind of pointless to do so.
Right. What's the upside
of it? That's definitely an element of its high ranking. Is it's not just that it's difficult, but that there's not a lot of payoff for it. There isn't anything special at this world that's worth trying to navigate these difficult situations.
And now that's not to say that Wizards maybe shouldn't look at doing a world, with a similar sort of idea in the future, or based on some cultural elements of, whether it be, say they go the Kamigawa route and they base it based on the religion, say, okay, we're going to do something vaguely Islamic, or maybe they base it on a specific region and they say we want it to be Persian, Babylonian, Sumerian. Maybe we want it to be, Saudi Arabian in nature, or specifically Syrian. We don't, that's not to say they shouldn't do something like that. They should, because I thought it was the coolest thing when I saw Ixalan being the first, Western Hemisphere culture essentially set, in Magic history. That's the first time that's happened, and I was so pumped about that. And it's got me thinking now about, although there are representation issues in this, not in his work. I'll get to my point here in a second. Not in his work, but in the idea of, again, representing a culture in the story in the game. But it got me thinking about Ryan Panko's fantasy frontier series of drawings. One of the Magic artists who's done sketches and paintings of what a fantasy setting in the American West would look like, sort of in that frontier, 1850s range. And, you'd have maybe instead of cat folk and that sort of thing, you'd have bison folk and that sort of stuff. And I think that's so cool. As somebody who lives in this country near those things, near bison, near the Great Plains, I think that would be so great to see in a Magic setting. But you have to be careful and deft about dealing with something like saying, any of these cultures specifically, reference Native Americans, or, reference the imperialism of white settlers into native lands back then. That's something you have to be very delicate about and know how you're approaching it. And I know that in preparation for this episode, when we were talking in our Twitter DMs, one thing that I mentioned that I thought I did a really great job of also representing religion in what could be a controversial way, and I know was a controversial way, that walked a lot of lines, that towed a lot of lines, but still managed to create what I think was a really incredible product, are the Assassin's Creed series of games, and it's beautiful to me what airs at the beginning of every single Assassin's Creed game. It's this little blurb this disclaimer that says, and it's changed a couple of times, but the original one: this game is inspired by historical events and characters. This work of fiction was designed, developed, and produced by a multicultural team of various religious faiths and beliefs. And eventually it was changed to also add sexual orientations and gender identities, which is also a great addition. But to me, that's important, because it wasn't a couple of white guys doing this. It wasn't just a couple of, Muslim guys. It wasn't just a couple of black guys. It wasn't just a couple of women. It was a huge team that sat down and said, we all bring different perspectives to this table, and we want to be respectful of each other's perspectives and the perspectives that we represent, that we are coming into this room and representing. And how do we make this game and this world incredible and compelling while still respecting everybody else's cultures? How do we bring these references in while still not slapping anybody in the face? That's our show. You can find the podcast at Goblin Lore Pod on Twitter, or you can email any questions, comments, or concerns to us at goblinlorepodcast@gmail.com. We've also now launched our Patreon, which you can find at patreon.com/goblinlorepod. Our $1 tier is open and gets you access to our private Discord server, where you can talk about all things lore and all things life. This episode was produced and edited by Joe Redeman, who you can find on Twitter at Findhorn. That's FYND Horn. This episode was hosted by Alex Newman, who you can find on Twitter at AlexanderNewM. Hobbs Q can be found on Twitter at HobbsQ. Goblin Lore is a member of the Geek Therapy Network. Geek Therapy is a network of like-minded individuals who seek to use our hobbies and our love of games to understand our minds and the cultures that we live in. To learn more about Geek Therapy, check them out at geektherapy.com or at Geek Therapy on Twitter. Thank you all for listening, and remember, goblins, like snowflakes, are only dangerous in numbers.